Hello and welcome back everyone to yet another lesson in the Python short course. Today we're going to discuss Python conditionals, which is an imperative part of many programming languages. With that being said, let's have a look at the objectives for today's lesson. Now, the objectives for today's lesson is as follows. First, we'll spend a bit of time defining Python conditionals, and then we'll move on to yet another practical demonstration. Let's start by providing a bit of insight to the question, and that is, what exactly are Python conditionals? Well, in essence, we can think of Python conditionals as statements or expressions. Another way to think of conditionals is that they are used for decision making in programming. The umbrella term for this tends to be control structures, and we can extrapolate this to real life. Let's take the example of weather. Sometimes when it's sunny outside, we might decide that we actually want to wear a pair of sunglasses. However, if it's raining, we might decide to carry an umbrella instead. The idea behind conditionals or control structures is that an outcome is generally based on the condition. And the most popular conditional across multiple programming languages is the if-else statement. Now, with that said, let's take a moment to review a simple architecture of conditionals, in this case, if-else statements. So we generally start our program by testing some sort of expression. Once that expression is tested, if the condition is true, we then carry out some block of code, or we carry out some body of the if statement which must be executed. However, if the condition is false, we take a different route instead, and we carry on with the next executable part of our code. Now, we mentioned the idea of if-else statements just a couple of seconds ago, but what exactly are they? Well, they come in various flavors. The if-else statement usually starts with an if, and if this condition is true, we carry out some block of code. Else if, or otherwise known as elif in Python programming, some other condition is true, we then carry out that block of code instead. Otherwise, the default refers to else. Else, if the if and the elif do not satisfy any condition, then we carry out the default statement, which is the else. One of the unique features or properties of the Python programming language is the idea of indentation. So, where many other programming languages rely on curly braces, Python relies on indentation to define the scope of a block of code. We'll often find that Java, JavaScript, C#, for example, all make use of curly braces, whereas Python, on the other hand, uses indentation. And indentation is extremely important when working with conditionals, functions, or iterations. If we fail to adhere to the rules of indentation, our code will never run. Now, before we dive into our practical session for today, let's have a look at the syntax for the if-else statement. So we generally start by testing if one expression is true. If that expression is true, we carry out the following statements. Else if any other conditions, that is to say, if any of the subsequent elif statements are true, then we tend to carry out the alternative statements instead. And lastly, if none of the conditions above are met with the if or the elif, we default to the else and we run the subsequent statements. With that said, and without further ado, let's dive right into our practical demonstration and let's start scripting. Now that I've booted up PyCharm, I'm simply going to get rid of all the boilerplate code, and do keep in mind that the folder structure I created for this new project is lesson 4. So the scenario we're going to work with in our if-else statement today, well, at least in this lesson, is going to be based on the weather condition scenario we mentioned earlier on. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to build a simple variable over here called weather conditions. And I'm going to set this equal to sunny for the time being, which is a string. And now we can start with the control structure, or the conditionals, if you will. And I'll simply say if the weather conditions is equal to sunny, I'll add a colon over here, and this is part of indentation. So this is our if statement, and we add an indentation to let Python know that whatever comes below, keep in mind, we indent like this. This is the block of code that needs to be run if this condition is met. That is to say, if weather conditions, which is the variable we created here, is equal to sunny, this is an operator, then do the following. And I'll simply just print the following string. Don't forget your sunglasses. Great. Next, I'll move on to the elif block. And the elif block works in the following way. If this condition is not true, we then move to the elif block to check if this condition is true. That basically implies that this is false and this one will be true, right? Well, at least in theory. So I'll say elif weather conditions is equal to rainy colon indentation, well, then print the following string. Be sure to grab your umbrella. And then lastly, I'll have an else condition here, which will be the default. That is to say, if none of these conditions are met, then run the default block of code. With the else condition, we don't have to specify anything because the algorithm will assume that these conditions are not met, therefore run the default. So once again, indentation, and I'll simply print you're all good to go. Great. So let's run our code and evaluate what the result looks like. I'll also just add a bit of spacing over here. So I'll hit run and you'll notice that the output is don't forget your sunglasses. And that is because the variable is set to sunny. However, if we change this to rainy, look at what happens to our output. I'll run the code once again. Now we get a different response or a different output. Be sure to grab your umbrella. So what exactly is happening here is that the conditions are being checked for our if else, depending on what the value of the variable is. The variable is the thing that we are checking to determine the condition. Now, if I decided to change rainy to something like fair, where the conditions are kind of fair, and I run this now, you'll notice my output is you're all good to go. And that is because this condition is not being satisfied, nor is this condition being satisfied. Thus, we end up with the default statement. And that is to say, else, you're all good to go. Now, I could have changed this to anything else besides sunny or rainy, and we'd still end up with the default condition. And that is basically it for working with conditionals and control structures in Python. Now, once again, in our cloud platform, I'm going to prove that this code is perfectly valid in the event that you don't really want to work with PyCharm. So I'll open up programiz.com and I'll paste my code. I'll then run this and you'll notice this code is perfectly valid. So what we've learned today is how to work with conditional statements in Python programming so that we can have some sort of decision control inside of the result that we actually get with our algorithm. In our next lesson, we're going to focus a bit more on Python functions, and we'll learn how to create our very own functions from scratch. So for all of that and more, I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.